Bounty hunters, vigilante justice, life sentences for trespassing, and mandatory DNA collection. If you thought immigration laws couldn't get any wilder, Mississippi just said, hold my sweet tea. Welcome back to Beyond the Bill Number, the podcast where we dig deep into the legislation shaping our world. Sometimes for the better, sometimes, well, let's just say for discussion purposes. I'm Stephen, and with me as always is my delightful co-host Sarah. Sarah, are you ready to unravel another wild legislative ride today?
Hi, Stephen. I am ready to dig in. Today, we're diving into two of the most aggressive immigration enforcement bills proposed so far this year, Mississippi's HB 1484 and Missouri's SB 72. These two bills are largely identical, derived from a so-called model bill, and they have bounty hunters, life imprisonment, and anonymous tip lines.
Okay, so let's start with some context then. We know that immigration policy has been a national flashpoint, especially under Trump's new agenda. Gone are the build the wall days, but what exactly has changed with immigration enforcement on a federal level that's motivating these state level bills?
That is a great question. Trump wasted absolutely no time ramping up immigration enforcement. On day one, he signed a slew of executive orders. It was kind of like a whole shtick that he did. But he signed a lot of executive orders dismantling longstanding protections when it came to immigrants and immigration policy here in the States. And we're seeing more ICE raids, broader deportation powers under the Laken Riley Act, which was the first act that Trump signed as president. And that we'll take a look at later this month. But there was really an emphasis also on local law enforcement cooperating with federal immigration authorities, which has kind of moved into this way of maybe it's not cooperation, but they're actually doing their own things, and it's getting a little bit muddy. What's different this time around is the state level of involvement, which is, again, you're not just agreeing and cooperating with these federal agencies, you're kind of owning your own stuff, which immigration policy has kind of always been a federal level thing. And some states are really jumping in with their own enforcement strategies, and that's where these two bills, Mississippi's House Bill 1484 and Missouri's Senate Bill 72, come in.
Right, right. So these bills took things to an extreme level then. So walk us through what they propose.
Yeah, so buckle up. They create the Illegal Alien Certified Bounty Hunter Program. Yes, you heard that right. Bounty hunters. Licensed bail bond agents could be certified to track and detain undocumented immigrants. And the penalties, being undocumented in Mississippi or Missouri, would be classified as felony trespassing, punishable by life imprisonment unless deported within 24 hours.
So life imprisonment just for being in the state without documentation. That really, really does go beyond extreme. It's also worth sort of noting one other thing here, that the program is called the Illegal Alien Certified Bounty Hunter Program. And that is a switch in tone, isn't it? I think federal agencies have been ordered by the Trump administration to start referring to immigrants as aliens rather than immigrants. Presumably because it makes them sound more scary, as though that's sort of, little green men from Mars or something.
This really is just extreme and kind of over the top. And it doesn't stop there. These bills would set up 24/7 anonymous tip lines where people could report undocumented immigrants or illegal aliens, complete with $1,000 reward for every arrest made due to a tip. And get this, anyone detained would also be required to submit a DNA sample.
Wow. Wow, the DNA collection part alone is a massive privacy red flag. Obviously, there have been many, many debates around how DNA should be collected, how it should be stored, how long it should be kept, all of those kind of things. But the bounty system sounds like it would open the door to sort of serious racial profiling.
Yeah, exactly. Critics immediately pointed out that deputizing private citizens to track down immigrants creates a dangerous vigilante-style system. And let's be real, when there's a financial incentive to anything, when is there not abuse? And if we're tying that to reporting people or things like that, it is just a whole can of worms that I don't think we will really want to be opening as a country, but.
Well, obviously the lawmakers responsible for these bills disagree with you there. So where are these bills going? Are they likely to actually become law?
Well, the Mississippi bill has died already in committee. It seems that the provisions were too extreme, even for this notoriously conservative legislature. And the Missouri bill is still alive and kicking, but it's in committee. And frankly, it's unlikely that either of these bills actually become laws, but that's almost beside the point. The fact that these bills have even been introduced and that we're discussing them and they're out there at all shifts the Overton window. And what the Overton window is the range of subjects and arguments that are politically acceptable to the mainstream population at a given time. And so we can kind of breathe a sigh of relief as they fail, but then we're kind of missing some other slightly less extreme bill. Will that one become mainstream? We're kind of seeing how our politics has changed over time. These Overton windows are changing, and we always talk about things that are acceptable today were not acceptable 60 years ago. And that's because of things like this over time being super outrageous, like women voting. And then, after 10 years of us being like, maybe women should vote, maybe women should vote. And, people not being like, oh, so ghastly that a woman could vote. And here I am, a voter. So
That's right, and that's the problem with all of these extreme rhetoric. I mean, the Overton window is good if it lets people talk about gender or sexuality, which obviously is sort of taboo subjects in the past, and now they're not. But when it becomes quite a sort of extreme rhetoric of sort of distrust and fear, it moves the norm of what's acceptable, and it also it sort of plays into people's sort of worst instincts rather than their best instincts. So rather than saying, let's protect this marginalized group over here that we don't normally talk about, so let's start talking about them. Instead, it's saying, hey, you distrust that person who looks different from you and has a different religion. Well, it's okay. That's okay. You can do that now. So yeah, very, very dangerous to sort of introduce these kind of bills and to actually promote the discussion. Of course, we're discussing it. What do? You can't not discuss it, can you? So are there any examples of other states following the examples of Mississippi and Missouri?
Oh, yeah. So, for example, Alabama's Senate Bill 53 takes a different approach, focusing on criminalizing anyone who harbors or assists undocumented immigrants. So, if you give someone a ride or rent them an apartment, you could be facing legal consequences.
Wow. I mean, there must be enormous legal concerns with these kinds of measures, really. So, I mean, as you've already said, immigration is a federal issue. It's supposed to be monitored and implemented on a federal level. So, how do these states think they can enforce this without stepping on federal toes? Or maybe they're not worried about that under the current climate.
That is one of the biggest questions. Federal courts have repeatedly ruled that immigration enforcement falls under federal jurisdiction. And these bills would likely face major constitutional challenges, not to mention the potential expensive lawsuits that would come cascading in. Plus, the severe penalties like life imprisonment for trespassing raise serious concerns of due process and cruel and unusual punishment concerns.
Absolutely. Not to mention the historical comparisons, of course. So this is one time when having a written constitution where such things are laid down is actually quite a good thing. It does provide at least some guardrails, doesn't it? Some critics have actually likened these bills to authoritarian regimes where neighbors were encouraged to spy and report on each other, and there were sort of various processes to sort of track down certain people and imprison them. Do you think that's a valid comparison?
They are not wrong. And there's kind of two different ways that we can look at this from a historical perspective. The first is in the United States. When we had slavery, there were bounty hunters that were hunting escaped slaves. There were penalties for people who were sheltering slaves to try to help get them to freedom in the North. And so there definitely is a tone of that even in our own history here. But when you set up these financial incentives for people to report on each other, often based on nothing more than kind of suspicion, you create a culture of fear. You create a culture of distrust. You are kind of creating a situation of something that's really eerily reminiscent of some of history's darker chapters. And I know everybody compares so much to Nazi Germany today, and it's kind of a really quick reaction for anyone that is a little left-leaning to do that. But this truly is almost act for act comparison of what is going on there between reporting people, between kind of these crazy, immediate, really harsh punishments, to read something like this and think of a world in the United States where this is how things are going is really scary.
Absolutely. So Do you think we're likely to see more of these kinds of bills?
Well, with the Trump administration pushing a much more aggressive take and kind of role in immigration, we'll likely see more of these bills popping up. And one of the things that is kind of a bigger shift from what Trump had said versus what we're kind of seeing today is all of these raids that we've been seeing all over the country. A lot of the immigrants that are getting detained are not these criminals. They're people who are working, and, ICE is headed to workplaces and rounding up these illegal immigrants. And, I think a lot of people can understand and get behind enforcing deportation and understanding that maybe immigrants that are criminals are not the best to be here. We had last week an episode on Florida, which was another good example where their session hasn't even started yet, but they've already called 2 special sessions trying to push really hardline immigration bills. And it's kind of seeming like this attitude of who can up-level the next state to be more intense and more severe. This really speaks to how this has truly become a boiling point in the US. And we found that during the campaign trail. We definitely see that now. But I think it's so important for us to be reasonable, remember our history, remember our origins, and actually remember what these people are doing here for the most part. They are part of our schools, our churches, and our communities, and really helping our country exist the way that it can be. And most people are just here trying to live a good life.
It's true. It's true. There's another element to this, which is that it's quite cunning to focus these laws on criminal illegal immigrants, because it's something that's very hard to disagree with. If you've got a murderer or a rapist who's an illegal immigrant, it's very difficult to say, no, let's defend that person. No, they should be able to stay. But the point is, nobody has ever done that, right? This is a classic tactic. Nobody has ever defended rapists and murderers who are illegal immigrants. If you only have to look at recent history, the president that deported the most people during their term was, of course, President Obama. And the way he did that was by going into prisons, identifying felons who were illegal aliens and deporting them. And it didn't create a hue or cry. The left weren't up in arms about this. Nobody was, because it's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. In fact, it's the law of the land all over the world. If you come into a country, if you're invited in, if you're given some kind of citizenship or some kind of right to live there, if you abuse that by committing a crime, then you are deported, and that's perfectly reasonable. But you don't catch criminal aliens by going into workplaces and rounding people up and so on. You don't need to do that. You go to the prisons, right? Because you're looking for people who've been convicted of crimes, not people who are suspected. But by focusing on this, they demonize all immigrants. And we've already discussed in the past about how immigrants are actually less likely to commit crimes than sort of native-born Americans. So by demonizing them, it's deeply, deeply damaging.
And one other piece of this, just to bring the lens back to a self-obsessed American, is these rules of imprisoning people for life just for being here illegally is putting such a tax burden on people in that state to keep those people in jail. And so it's one of these things where it's like, this doesn't make any sense, because the people in the state where these things are going to be paying an undue cost. In Mississippi and Missouri, do you guys really have the tax dollars to be sheltering, feeding, and housing all of these people for all of these years, for the rest of their lives, just because they deigned to step foot on your land and be undocumented? That is so weird and just doesn't make any sense to me. Maybe that's why the bill failed, but maybe the tax implications are enough to make people realize that maybe this isn't the right way. I'm not sure.
Yes, absolutely. It's important to keep a close eye on this, because, as we said before, it's about the Overton window at the end of the day, isn't it? So we can get outraged at these bills that are very unlikely to pass. And I think even the people who introduce them know that they're extreme and that they're unlikely to pass, and that they're pretty much unworkable. But we need to keep our eye on those other more reasonable immigration bills that just a few months ago probably weren't reasonable.
Yes. No, this is definitely a warning sign, and the more extreme our politics get, the more extreme that these bills get when they're introduced, it's more likely to see these less extreme versions, like you said, and even what we talked about last week in Florida and these 2 special sessions. I think we're going to be doing a lot of wading through things.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And that's a wrap for today's episode of Beyond the Bill Number. So if you found today's discussion eye-opening, be sure to subscribe and leave us a review, of course. And as always, stay informed, stay engaged, and we'll see you next time.